What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Alright, so as we get to the conclusion of Spider-Man Clone Saga, one of the questions that I've seen in the comments is, why didn't we cover the whole thing? Alright, here's the reason why we didn't cover the whole thing. Here's a really good example. There's a point in the story where Gwen Stacy comes back, and we learn that the Gwen Stacy we see in the story is a clone pretending to be a woman, pretending to be a clone. That's just one example, and there's a multitude of others. For example, between the story Crossfire, I think it was, that dealt with this guy, Judas Traveler, who could cast illusions. Guy had nothing to do with Clone Saga. But between that story and the trial of Peter Parker, the last video that we did, about 3 months passed, in the sense that the trial of Peter Parker was released 3 months after it was originally supposed to be. It basically fell behind by about 3 months or so. Because of that, what Marvel did is they went through and they basically just flooded the entire Spider-Man landscape with nothing but like one-shots and miniseries. They were just giving us stories that had almost nothing to do with the Clone Saga, or if they did associate with the Clone Saga, they didn't move the story in any direction. It was literally just filling time. And so because of that, if I were to go through and make those videos, one, I would get lost. I would get confused. I'd have to go back and we'd probably end up seeing delays on the videos. And between all the declaration of retcons and changes and all that kind of good stuff, it would confuse me and it would probably confuse you, and you'd probably get frustrated and just stop watching the video. But one of the big revelations that came with all this was the fact that where previously it was believed that the Jackal was the one who was behind all the events of the Clone Saga, that the Jackal was the one who had made Ben Reilly, the Jackal was the one who had made Kane, the Jackal was the one that set all these events in motion and all that kind of good stuff. What ended up happening is Marvel basically came back and said, no, that's not true. Everything we've told you was a lie. And that's why fans got so bent out of shape and why they got so angry, is because just when they thought they were beginning to get a grasp on this insanely convoluted story, well then suddenly Marvel came along and said, no, that's actually not true at all. Instead, the real mastermind behind the entire events of the Clone Saga is none other than Norman Osborn. Now, this was kind of cool, but it was also kind of weird. I personally thought it was interesting that Norman Osborn had made a return, and the way that this was done, the way his return was written, was actually kind of interesting. I mean, there are those who just hated this. They absolutely despised it. But there were some like me who didn't really think it was that bad. But with regards to Norman Osborn, this is the first time he comes back in Marvel Comics following his death at the hands of Peter Parker after the night Gwen Stacy died. Norman Osborn had basically died in Amazing Spider-Man issues 121 and 122 during the fight between himself and Peter Parker after the death of Gwen Stacy. The story was really kind of leading up to the death of the Green Goblin. The biggest problem that Marvel had, though, was that the Green Goblin was huge in terms of popularity. I mean, it was absolutely nuts. And so because of that, Marvel had to eventually bring him back, or they had to bring back the Green Goblin concept in some form or fashion. Now, what this story does is it actually invokes a lot of that stuff, but it tells us what it was that Norman Osborn was doing behind the scenes. What we know is that, again, because he would basically just kind of resurrected, or at least he had just come back to life just because of the Goblin formula in his veins that basically allowed his body to heal, which allowed him to come back, instead of just immediately popping up on the scene and just saying, I'm Norman Osborn, and going back and attacking Peter Parker again. Instead, because of the fact that the death of Gwen Stacy had unhinged Peter Parker to a degree, I mean, it didn't make him crazy, but because it had unhinged him to a degree, the goal of Osborn was to basically take away everything that Peter Parker cared about. And so what he ended up doing was basically operating behind the scenes and building an empire of sorts for himself. Now, one of the other reasons why it was that Osborn didn't intervene, at least the indication is given here, is because of the fact that his son Harry Osborn had taken up the mantle of Green Goblin. Again, that was something that had already been written, and so really, because this has already been established, because it was an intrinsic part of the Spider-Man mythos, Marvel couldn't go back and change it, right? Like, that's the nature of a retcon in a lot of different ways. For those of you guys who are new to comic books, a retcon stands for retroactive continuity, and what that means is that there are, concrete pillars in the realm of Marvel Comics. For example, Captain America Steve Rogers, or I guess the guy Steve Rogers, received an injection that gave him the super soldier serum, which led to him becoming Captain America. Peter Parker was bitten by a radioactive spider. Those are things that do not change. The motivation for why those happened have changed from time to time, and that's how a retcon works. For example, with regards to Captain America, it was previously believed that there was just a guy named Abraham Erskine that injected him with the super soldier serum, and he became Captain America. America. Done and done. It was simple as that. It wasn't until years later that we learned he was the first in a long line of people that were part of Weapons Plus. He was Weapon 1, which went all the way up to Weapon X or Weapon 10 that led to Wolverine. So that's what I'm talking about when I say retroactive continuity. The idea of Harry Osborn having donned the Green Goblin costume and becoming the second Green Goblin, that's something that's unshakable, that's concrete. You can't get rid of that in the Spider-Man landscape because it's so intrinsic to Peter Parker himself and his relationship to Harry Osborn. And so instead of changing that, Marvel had to work around that and just say, well, you know, Norman Osborn was just in the background watching all these events unfold. And it's like that with virtually everything that goes on. When it comes to Phil Urich being the next iteration of the Green Goblin and then going on to become the Hobgoblin, Marvel couldn't change those because they're concrete aspects of the Spider-Man mythos. And so instead, when it came to Norman Osborn, they had to simply work around it by having him just watch all these events unfold. Now, what Osborn had done is, while he was in the background, again, because he was forming an empire, what he needed were resources. He needed a vast network of information. And so what he did is he actually joined a group called the Brotherhood of the Screers. Now, the Brotherhood of the Screers is a cabal that's been around for, God, forever and ever and ever and ever. And they really just kind of like worship this cosmic entity, so to speak, one of these elder gods that has supposedly been around for decades. It's one of those instances where Marvel, kind of brings in like a cabal or like a cult of sorts and says this cult worships a particular god, and this god is a god that we just made up, but he's been around for a few, million years or billions of years or whatever. It's just one of those things they interject in a story just for the sake of giving this group a particular basis. But the fact remains that being part of the Brotherhood of the Screers meant that with Norman Osborn, because the Screers care only about money and power and accumulating it in any means necessary, it basically gave Norman Osborn access to a vast array of money and resources that he wouldn't normally have. And so what he was able to do is, while he wasn't in New York itself, he was basically operating out of Europe, it allowed him to use his network to keep tabs on everything that was going on. And what this did is it led to Osborn learning that the Jackal Miles Warren was creating clones. That after the death of Gwen Stacy and, Peter Parker kind of defeating Norman Osborn, that Miles Warren, who was in love with Gwen Stacy, chose to get his revenge on Peter Parker by cloning Gwen Stacy and cloning Peter himself. And this is when the whole basis of the idea of Kane and Ben Reilly and all that stuff begins to come into play. Because what ended up happening here is that where Miles Warren basically dispatched one of his guys, one of his Screer agents, to go meddle with things and to keep an eye on things, we found out this happened in two forms. The first was in the form of Miles Warren himself, and the second was Seward Trainer. Because of the fact that Miles Warren was creating these clones, while Osborn didn't really ally himself with Miles Warren, what he did do is he looked at his views and said, I can use the work that Miles Warren's trying to achieve for my own goals somewhere later on down the line. And so Screer basically showed up and said, I will help you achieve what it is that you want to do. I will not tell you who I'm working for, and I will not tell you why, but I will help you achieve this goal. And Miles Warren the Jackal just accepted that aid because in truth, he really kind of needed it. At the same time, Seward Trainer was a guy who was basically working for the Jackal. Now again, in our last video, we had covered Seward Trainer and simply saying that Seward was a longtime friend of Ben Reilly. He was really intelligent when it came to genetics. And of course, he's a guy that, was the one that made the revelation, made the statement that Peter Parker's the clone and Ben Reilly's the original. The reason for that is because of the fact that this Screer had shown up to Seward Trainer while he was trying to steal information from the Jackal and said, I will keep your secret. I will not tell the Jackal that you're trying to steal his documents and his notes so you can pawn it off as your own. And instead, I will come to you at some point along the line and I will ask a favor. And so in the background of all this stuff, with the help of the Screer, Miles Warren created Kane as the first clone. Kane suffered from cellular degeneration and was basically discarded by Miles Warren. This led to Miles Warren trying again and then eventually creating Ben Reilly and Gwen Stacy. Now, of course, this led into the very first time that Ben Reilly and Peter Parker fought one another, which we saw in the events of the original Amazing Spider-Man Clone Saga story in Spider-Man 149, 150, and 151, I think it was. Now, because of the fact that this conflict had eventually led to the idea of Peter Parker defeating Ben Reilly, again, Peter looked at the clone and said, if anybody becomes aware of the fact that this clone is here and they unmask it, they'll look at this clone's face and realize that Spider-Man is Peter Parker. My identity will be out there in the world. And so Peter had basically taken the body of the clone, dumped it down a smokestack, and walked away. What we found out was that Miles Warren had basically taken this clone out of the smokestack and then replaced it with a clone skeleton and then just sort of sent Ben Reilly along the way, messing with his mind a little bit. Now again, Miles Warren didn't do this because Norman Osborn told him to. Norman Osborn was just watching all these events unfold from the background. Instead, Miles Warren was doing all of this of his own accord, but what it did afford him to do is the chance to basically look at this and say, I can grab this corpse somewhere along the line if I want to and use it for my own ends. But the whole idea of Osborn was looking at the character of Ben Reilly, and the reason for this was because his hope, even though it wasn't really part of his main plan, his hope was that with Ben Reilly basically revealing to Peter Parker that he was alive, that Reilly himself was alive, and that Reilly was basically a clone of Peter that intended to be there, that it would unhinge Peter in his entirety, and it would basically send his entire life into a tailspin, possibly drive him insane and he'd be institutionalized or any number of things that would lead to his life going into complete and total disarray. The problem with this is that, as we know, that didn't happen. Instead, what basically took place was that Peter himself ended up bonding with Ben Reilly. The two of them were very akin to brothers. When Mary Jane Watson became pregnant, Peter Parker ultimately ended up leaving and vacating the role. Now, what this does is this begins the process of bringing in some of the interim stories that took place between the trial of Peter Parker and the conclusion of Spider-Man Clone Saga. Now, one of the reasons why we left some of those stories out is just because of the fact that this covers everything. But what Norman Osborn did is where Peter said, okay, look, Ben Reilly, according to Seward Trainer, according to the revelation that he gave us, you are the one who is the original. I'm the clone. I'm taking my wife. We've smoothed things over after I, slapped her across the face, basically. We're taking off to Oregon and we are going to go live a normal life. You be Spider-Man here in New York. Now, of course, when that happened, fans were pissed. I mean, they were so angry. It was one of the craziest things ever. People were just so outraged because they wanted Peter Parker to stay. It's the Spider-Man they're going attached to. And in a lot of ways, that makes sense. I mean, remember, Spider-Man has a heritage and the realm of comic books. He's the one that really set the stage in a lot of different ways. The Teen Titans were his predecessor to a degree, but in terms of the standing that Spider-Man created, the mark that he basically left in the comic book community, it'll stand the test of time. I mean, remember, ever since the 1940s, there were no kid superheroes, and if you were a kid superhero, you were a sidekick. The Teen Titans set the stage by saying, we as teenagers can have our own stories, but they were a team. But Spider-Man was the first time that we saw a successful teenager on the main stage with his own solo story. Spider-Man really helped to empower a lot of teenage kids who sat around wishing, man, I wish I could be a superhero too. And that's why Spider-Man was so significant, and that's why he changed so many things. And so with Peter Parker being moved out of the landscape, all that time that people had grown with this character, all those experiences that they had, all the times they'd seen him struggle, whether they had gotten in during the night Gwen Stacy died or read afterwards when he had picked up in a relationship with Mary Jane Watson, they were part and parcel to his life, and they didn't want to see that go away. And so because of that, there was a lot of backlash to the idea of Ben Reilly taking over the role, but Marvel kept on keeping on. And so what we saw was that, with the exception of a couple of instances when Peter Parker would appear in the comics, all the villains, all the stories of Spider-Man fighting Mysterio and, Venom and Carnage and so on and so forth, all that dealt with Ben Reilly. Now, there was an event that ended up bringing Peter Parker back, and this was basically Norman Osborn grabbing the corpse, or at least having the smokestack torn down, that resulted in people discovering this corpse that was wearing a Spider-Man outfit. Now, because of the fact that Ben Reilly himself didn't know about this, because Peter Parker didn't know about this, ultimately they ended up coming back. Because remember, in Peter Parker's mind, the body he threw down the smokestack was gone. That was Ben Reilly, but there was never any reason for him to question whatever happened to that body in the smokestack. He just kind of wondered, well, I guess Ben Reilly survived or something. I have no idea. And that was really it. There really wasn't a whole lot of exposition or a whole lot of investigation there. But with this body being discovered, the question became, okay, where did this body come from and what's going on? And so it led to Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson coming back. The other half of this, and it's really one of the most tasteless things that I've ever seen in comic books, was the idea of the child that Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson had. Because of the fact that fans wanted to see Spider-Man come back, Marvel said, fine, we'll give you Peter Parker, but it's going to come at a cost. And so what they did is they basically had the child of Mary Jane Watson and Peter Parker killed. Like, it died. It was stillborn, which that's not really something that I agree with, and it's not something that I would bring up in this video, but it's probably a question people are going to have, so I figure we might as well answer it. Not the best decision that Marvel's made over the course of their life. Those people who read far enough back to remember the Clone Saga, look at that moment, maybe some of the other events in Clone Saga and Spider-Man One More Day, and say, I don't understand. I don't grasp what it is that's going. That was a really poor decision on behalf of Marvel. At least that's how they look at it anyway. And regardless of how it played out, it resulted in Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson coming back to New York to investigate everything that was going on. Now, with the return of Peter Parker, Norman Osborn effectively had to speed up his own plans. But something else that I also want to talk about here is the character of Kane. And the reason why is because of the fact that Kane had just kind of been left out in no man's land following the events of the trial of Peter Parker. He was still a character, he was still in the stories, but he didn't nearly play the same kind of role that he did before, because all of his involvement, everything that we had seen about him being mysterious, nobody really knowing what he was, all that basically led up to the trial of Peter Parker when he revealed himself to be the very first clone. After that, it's like, well, what do we do now? Where do we go from here? And so what ended up happening is Kane actually ended up going back to the Jackal, Miles Warren, in order to try to find a way to cure him of his clone degeneration. Miles Warren more or less scoffed at him, laughed him off. At the same time, the Jackal basically wanted to create like a giant planet full of clones. This led to a massive conflict between Spider-Man and Ben Reilly and Kane and the Jackal and so on and so forth. But presumably Kane was believed to have been killed. He was thrown in a regeneration tube, eventually came back, and then handed himself over to the cops, for the crimes that he had committed and the things that he had done before. So it was a way for Marvel to just kind of quickly dispense of him, just say, okay, fine, whatever, Kane's gone, who cares? And that was it. And so by the time we got to the conclusion of the Clone Saga, we basically ended up picking up with just Ben Reilly and Spider-Man himself. Now remember, all these things with Norman Osborn took place behind the scenes. Peter Parker, Ben Reilly, none of these guys had any idea that this was going on. They had no idea that Norman Osborn was still alive. And so what's really cool here is the way that this picks up, this last little tidbit, we actually end up having like J. Jonah Jameson and Robbie Robertson, the editor-in-chief of the Daily Bugle. They're all basically brought to the Daily Bugle in this one particular room for a meeting. But the crazy thing is that they've all received invitations from different people. And so this was done directly by Norman Osborn, who basically revealed himself to be alive to Peter Parker. And the way that this ended up happening is he basically just kind of subdues him by using some sort of gas that basically permeates his body and is designed specifically for Peter, just kind of a targeted gas that, keeps him woozy and keeps him aware of what's going on. But ultimately, Norman Osborn basically just reveals everything that we just went over. So we don't really have to go over it again. But this is all brand new to Peter Parker. And that's the crazy thing, is because he has no idea that any of this stuff happened. He had no idea what was taking place. Not only that, Norman Osborn demonstrates that he had captured and defeated Ben Reilly. Now, this is something that had taken place in a different comic. I didn't really feel like it was necessary to run over just because of the fact that we could cover it here. Whether we go through and do the comic play-by-play or discuss it, it's still more or less the same thing. Ben Reilly's basically defeated and incapacitated by the Green Goblin. And so what this was designed to do anyway was lead to this great big huge return of the Green Goblin himself. Not only that, Ben actually reveals to Peter Parker that where Norman had basically taunted him after defeating him, saying, hey, look, I'm going to kill all the most important members of Peter Parker's family. Ben Reilly divulges this information to Peter and says, everybody that J. Jonah Jameson, Robbie Robertson, all the people that you've met over the course of your life who are significant to you, Green Goblin's going to kill them all. He's going to kill every last one of them. And so what this does is it turns into a race against time. It turns into Peter Parker trying to get to the Green Goblin as fast as he can and ultimately defeat him. Now, at this point, it really turns into kind of a cat and mouse game. And that's really the way it works when it comes to the Green Goblin and, Spider-Man fighting. It's always this idea of, Green Goblin chasing Spider-Man around, Spider-Man running away while he formulates a plan, turning the tables on the Green Goblin. It's really kind of a hallmark of their characters, or at least, when they first fought anyway. But the fact remains, with Norman Osborn, the way he intended to basically take down all these different members of Spider-Man's family, more or less, or the people that he knows, is to literally booby trap the building and then just destroy it in its entirety using these different, bombs that he's created, these different goblin bombs. Now, of course, Ben Reilly's able to get them out, but again, this continues to lead into a fight directly between Peter and Norman Osborn. Now, something to keep in mind here is that this is not just like a regular fight, right? Like, Peter Parker looked at the entire events of the Clone Saga, because while we didn't go over every single thing, you have to think about it from the mind of Peter. Peter's been told he's a clone on 2 occasions. He's come across 2 other clones of himself. Mary J. Watson was pregnant. He was going to have a child that basically ended up dying. And then he finds out the entirety of his life with regards to all these clones has been manipulated by Norman Osborn. And on top of all that, Aunt May passed away. Peter Parker is about as close to being as insane as he's ever going to be, totally losing his mind. Going against Norman Osborn with his, the goblin formula inside of his own blood, in a lot of ways, allows Peter to actually cut loose. And that's really what this is. It's a chance for Peter to basically just sort of cut loose and take out all of his anger anger and all of his wrath on Norman Osborn, and rightfully so. That's one of the reasons why this was kind of a big deal, is because of the fact that it's not like Norman Osborn just happened to show up at the wrong time and say, I'm back, and Peter just lost his mind and attacked Norman Osborn. Norman is the source of all the suffering that Peter Parker has experienced in a lot of different ways. Now keep in mind, Norman's not responsible for the death of Aunt May. He's not responsible for the death of Peter Parker's daughter. He's an easy target because he's basically screwed up everything else. And so again, in the midst of trying to kill Peter, what he actually does is try to kill him using his own Goblin glider, only for Ben Reilly to jump in the way and to be impaled by it. Now, this was Marvel sitting down and saying, okay, look, we tried. We tried to get rid of Peter Parker. We tried to eliminate him. We tried to replace him with Ben Reilly. Nobody wanted him there. You know, the biggest problem that Marvel faced, though, was that if they, you know, let's say, for example, they left Ben Reilly alive, somebody could have come along and said, oh, guess what, guys? Remember that Clone Saga? Well, it turns out Ben Reilly was the original the entire time. It would have just reopened this massive Pandora's box of things that people just didn't want to come back anymore. It would have just, you know, restarted this whole great big huge era that people would rather just kind of leave in the past, that even Marvel itself would rather leave in the past. And so because of this, you know, with Norman Osborn basically being responsible for the death of Ben Reilly, it leads to this final conflict between the two of them. Norman Osborn is able to make his escape. You know, he's able to get away, and the Green Goblin lives yet again. But Peter Parker is also able to basically give Ben Reilly the farewell that he deserves. But the way that Marvel came along and said, Ben Reilly is definitively the clone, Spider-Man is definitively the original, is because of the fact that when Ben Reilly basically dies, his body breaks down and it just kind of dissolves. And the reason why that matters is because of the fact that in addition to Ben Reilly and Kane, there were a whole host of other clones that we didn't even talk about. We didn't really get their names or anything like that. They were for the most part nameless. And it was really a segment whereby the Jackal had like this army of clones chase down Ben Reilly over the course of the city. All the clones were basically defeated, or they were all killed off, and then they just more or less disintegrated. But it was Marvel establishing the fact that this is what happens to clones. Whenever clones are defeated or whenever they die, their bodies just break down and they just sort of dissolve and go away. And so this was essentially killing off the character of Ben Reilly, saying Ben Reilly's gone and he's never going to come back again, or at least, you know, not in this capacity. So again, that basically ended the Clone Saga. It essentially all just kind of called it a day. Everything went away. Peter Parker, of course, goes back to Mary Jane Watson, you know, after realizing that his child had essentially died, and the two of them grieve the best they can. But ultimately, it creates this kind of clean break where it sets the stage for the follow-up stories of Peter Parker absent the Clone Saga and dealing a little bit with the aftermath, but almost immediately sweeping it all under the rug and moving on to the next best thing. But with that being said, guys, we have finished this Clone Saga. I mean, we did the best with what we had. I think we did a pretty good job. Hopefully you got the core of everything and it all came together pretty well. And hopefully you guys understand everything that's going on in terms of the characters and the events and, you know, the intricacies of, you know, the important things anyway. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Core. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.